I'm going to give a short introduction of Professor Dr. Piro and then myself, and then he's going to give us a little bit of input, and then we're going to start with the questions. I'm going to break the ice with a few questions from our side, from myself and the foundation, and then we're going to get to your questions. So you can keep sending us questions even while he's giving his input and also while I'm doing my questions. So first of all, about the man of the hour, Dr. Piro Rexhepi holds a PhD in politics from the University of Strathclyde, and he has held research fellowships at the universities of Graz, Rijeka, and the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. And he's also held teaching positions at the State University of New York, the City University of New York, and New York University, as well as Northampton Community College. And his research focuses on decoloniality, sexuality, and Islam, with a particular emphasis on the Balkans. And he's also got a new book coming out with Duke University Press, which is called White Enclosures: Race and the Colonial Origins of the Balkan Refugee Route. So I'm excited to have him here as our guest, and I'm going to give the word to you to tell us what you've prepared for us.
Thank you, Melina, for the generous introduction, and thank you to Pia and Anil, who is not here with us tonight, although I hope he's feeling well. So I'll keep my opening remarks as short as possible so that we can have more time for the discussion. This year marks the 10th anniversary of Fatma El-Tayyeb's seminal work called European Others. I want to start this talk by thinking through this text because I think Fatima's work has not only been immensely influential in addressing the politics of racelessness and colorblind attitudes that dominate debates about Europe, but also because it says almost everything that needs to be said about the subject. And so the question that I have for us tonight is, why are we back here again? Why are we still discussing narratives of Europeanness? What's left to be said about its borders, and why this question matters? I mean, surely we would all be tired of these same questions had it not been for the ongoing efforts to reproduce European innocence in, say, contrast to the US or to the normalization of far-right and fascist movements in Europe, as if those were two opposing political spectrums and not part of the same racist and colonial refractions that are foundational to the European Union, but particularly its border regimes. So while Fatma El-Tayyeb's work covers the questions of race and migration and colorblind ideologies within the EU, in this brief talk tonight, I want to expand that framework and examine how for the last 3 decades, European integration of East European spaces has reinforced and solidified a racial border infrastructure that sprawls from the Baltics down to the Balkan route. That this project of EU integration is actually a process of racial borderization is obvious in the mainstreaming of racial politics across the Balkans and broader East European spaces. Far-right parties in power in Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Croatia have all organized around the idea of united Europe under threat from demographic decline, sometimes enacted as migrants, other times as Muslims, and frequently as both groups. From the Hungarian Fidesz government policy of procreation, not migration, to the Bulgarian government racial demographic policies that encourage the reproduction of white Bulgarians to counterbalance the supposed demographic rise of Roma, Muslim refugee, and retiree populations. One thing is clear, these are not political formations that oppose Europe, as we are generally told in a binaristic division between Europeanism versus Euroscepticism. They're all empowered and emboldened by a pan-European project, which amounts to nothing short of a racial unity. So much like the EU, far-right parties invoke Europe as a post-national geopolitical entity tied by common history and geography, defined primarily through race and religion. So far from being Eurosceptics, far-right parties in Eastern Europe consider their integration into the European Union structures the backbone of their ascendance, and see the sealing of borders as fulfillment of post-Cold War promise of a global gated, white gated community. Indeed, in the last 2 years, the EU has exceeded far-right expectations by overhauling its asylum policies, which have now produced a public-private carceral border regime amounting to a growing industry that bolstered its spending for border security from 5.6 billion euros for the period from 2014 to 2020 to 21.3 billion euros for the period covering 2021-2027. A good amount of that money has landed in the hands of governments along the Balkan route, accompanied by the 2019 deployment of EU border and coast guards through the rapid border intervention agreements, as they're known, with countries that are aspiring to become EU member states as they negotiate their own freedom of movement within the EU at the expense of policing the movement of migrants on the Balkan route. Moreover, since October of last year, the EU has contracted state-owned Israel Aerospace Industries and Israel's largest private weapon manufacturer, Elbit, to design a wholesale drone surveillance system to track migrants along the Greek coast and the Bulgarian-Turkish border based on their effective use in the ongoing siege of Gaza in the occupied Palestinian territories. Simultaneously, there is now an ongoing effort by EU parliamentary officials to either cover up border violence by classifying migrant torture reports or attributing them to nation-state border policing strategies as supposedly separate realms of sovereignty. In one such instance last year that was publicized in The Guardian, EU officials classified details of Croatian border police beating and dismembering migrant fingers and pushing them back to Bosnia with shaved heads, spray-painted crosses in their heads, so that the drone surveillance system could monitor their movement in the forest. So rather than considering these European border and enclosure sites along the Balkan route as mere outcomes of military border corporatism or transient populist electoral platforms, I suggest we situate the Balkan route in the larger context of coloniality of race and borders, because these transformations raise fundamental questions about the nature of European borders, not only as contemporary coagulation of white world walling of capital accumulated within European spaces, but also as colonial formations of race bent on bolstering white demographics at its edges. So the Balkan route has now become a European enclosure of surveillance, sequestering, sorting, torturing, and incarcerating migrants, part of what Achille Membe calls the emergence of archipelago of carceral spaces across global peripheries. While spaces are now visible around the world, I want to focus on the Balkan route, not because I think it's a unique site of carceral and racial capitalist border regimes, but because it's an overlooked site of connected global histories of race and coloniality. And I want to draw here what the Balkan route represents in the imaginary of far-right and white supremacist groups in the West and how they make their own connections. So when white supremacists in Europe and the United States have made references to, for instance, the Bosnian or the Kosovo War, like Andres Berevik in the 2011 Manifesto European Declaration of Independence, which calls for the extermination of Muslims and Roma from the Balkans, to the Christchurch terrorist shooter in 2019 who drew inspiration for his attack from the Bosnian genocide, they all form part of what people are referring to as a Reconquista ideology that dominated also the white internationalist battalions that took part in the war in Bosnia and Kosovo, who saw themselves as the new crusaders and conquistadors defending Europe and Christianity at its Balkan borderlands. Their race imaginaries being identical to the border points policed today by EU border police policies. Rather than suggesting these are entirely new political realities, I invite you to think through these processes as expanded, modern, colonial, racialized relations of power, because the way in which these histories are reactivated today to remake race through the imposition of border regimes across global borderlands suggests a much more protracted geopolitical undertaking of white supremacy in both scope and shape, one unique neither to the EU or the US, but part of a larger transatlantic coloniality. So in these larger cartographies of white supremacy, the Balkan route serves as a racial sanitary cordon of colonial difference, not as a separate or supposedly independent nation states submerged in interethnic violence, but as interdependent and protracted forms of regimes of power that have come to facilitate a sort of a filtering of refugees for the European inner core through parallel processes of interpolicing their own racialized populations. This mandate policing the borders of the EU enclosure at its edges is thus presented as an auspicious opportunity to be saved once and for all through European integration in the name of ostensibly regional, but actually racial stability. Indeed, one of the reasons that far-right groups in Eastern Europe have amassed such overwhelming power, it's precisely because their racist border security discourse that dabbles in eugenics and demographic threats is aligned with EU border policies, and it's not in opposition to it. And I'm going to stress this over again because it's so important. This is what allows the far-right leaders across the region today to deploy racist rhetoric in their political campaigns, like Bojko Borisov in Bulgaria, Janez Janša in Slovenia, both of whom see in Viktor Hurban, the Hungarian hero, who calls for the defense of the European civilization from migrant invasion at its eastern gates. But what's important to note is also that this is not only specific to the far right. The left in the region engages in similar discourse. Last year, Alexis Tsipras, the leader of the once hope left in the region, the Syriza party, warned that refugees do not come to Greece to stay. They are coming to move here through, arrive, and their eventual direction or destination rather is Europe, echoing the same reactionary alignments of the regional right with Europe that is not just targeting migrants, but also, like I said, local Roma people, women, queer, trans, and Muslim communities. In February 2019, for instance, Bulgaria's defense minister and then deputy prime minister Krasimir Karakanchov announced the concept for changes in the integration policy of the Roma ethnicity in the Republic of Bulgaria. In the measures for the implementation of these policies, he writes, quote, "In view of indiscriminate high birth rates among the Roma, the Bulgarian government is undertaking ghetto eradication measures, tackling Roma crime, community service, controlling social benefits, stopping childbirth, and many other mechanisms for the real integration of this ethnicity," end quote. These policy frameworks have been actively deployed in the ongoing violent displacement and dispossession of Roma communities, not just in Bulgaria, but throughout the Balkans. Indeed, we recently witnessed how during the COVID pandemic, Roma neighborhoods around Bulgaria, which were already being subjected to displacement through the demolition of their homes since 2017, were sealed off from the rest of the country and subjected to austere measures of isolation, while the rest of the Bulgarian population moved relatively freely. That these measures have taken place in the background of refugee crisis is not accidental, but part and parcel of a regional racist panic of demographic decline that see racialized communities, feminist, queer, and trans movements as co-conspirators in destabilizing the health and reproduction of the nuclear family, and by extension, the nation and its presumably white, heterosexual, Christian, and therefore European population. These policies are driven also by economic and political incentives coming from the European Union. Containing refugees has not only become an important revenue stream, but also a momentary opportunity for the peripheral Eastern European states to use their migrant control and containment as a negotiating leverage for EU funding that relies on protracted forms of racism in the region. So I want to close by thinking through some of these more protracted forms of Europeanness and racism in post-socialist spaces through the work of Selma Selman, because I think her confrontation of Roma racism in the Balkan region unsettles not just the politics of the far right, but also the silence and compliance with racism in leftist movements. One of the best commentaries on this intersection of racial capitalism, class, gender, and coloniality is her performance piece called Self-Portrait, which you can find it online if you just Google Selma Selman self-portrait. In this project, Selma, who is a Roma artist from Bosnia, takes the electronic waste that people deposit in Roma neighborhoods across peripheries of Balkan cities to demolish them in the city centers. In my conversations with Selma, she has described the process of the performance as wanting to spare no one from the noise of capitalist violence. So she says you can deposit your waste in the periphery and return to the comfort of the center, making abstract noise about rights. For instance, she says, I choose to demolish a washing machine because I was trying to point out how the work of waste recycling that takes place in Roma neighborhoods forces us to reckon with racist, gender, and environmental violence that results from capitalism. Selma's work is important because in confronting the post-socialist left and liberal peripheralization of the questions of racism and refugees, it also exposes the comfortable collusion with the EU and its captive border regime in the region. Selma comes from Bihać, the site of refugees, where the spaces once used for refugees from the Bosnian genocide now serve as EU-sponsored camps for migrant detention, connecting her own racialized reality in Bosnia to the refugees that are being pursued along the Balkan route to prevent them from entering Europe. In a virtual reality performance called No Space, she says that there is no space for you here echoes the same term that Roma people encounter in the Balkans when looking for jobs or housing. That is not, these are not disconnected forms, but rather constitute the same message that is being given to refugees when they are told that there is no space for you here. I think I will stop here, but I would like to add that when we think about what is going on in the Balkan route and the way in which this color blindness operates, it's impossible not to think of how, for instance, the EU Parliament issued a statement in support of Black Lives Matter in June of 2020, and many migrants on social media asked if this included Black lives on the Mediterranean or the Balkan route, that the EU is actively involved in shooting, pushbacks, or covering up information on violence at its borders, as I just mentioned. So I think in addressing racelessness and color blindness, there's a collusion and the attention that is being given to the far right. Meanwhile, there's also collusion with left and liberal mainstream politics that all form part of the discourse to peripheralize race and the question of refugees. Meanwhile, it's omnipresent in the everyday reality of people who live and pass through the Balkan route. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of things to talk about here. Maybe we should start at like the beginning of the beginnings, maybe the most basic question, who is excluded from these dominant Western European narratives of Europeanness, and how does that exclusion work?
So I think, I mean, one way to think of what I'm assuming you mean in Eastern Europe, right? And with the EU enlargement, I think what happens is that with the end of the Cold War, the process of EU integration meant that, well, okay, Eastern Europeans are somewhat Europeans, and if we put them in this hierarchical process of improving their rule of law, anti-corruption, free market, economic reforms, and so forth, eventually they will become fully European. So Eastern Europeans already emerge as tainted Europeans, in part because they are seen as coming out of a system that is archaic, namely socialism. And so they need to be emancipated into the European Union by way of free market economy, which primarily has meant the privatization of public wealth and public enterprises. But in the process, there's internal others within these countries as well. And they emerge as complete outsiders. So for instance, if let's say a person from Poland or Hungary can travel freely to Western Europe, we know for a fact that Roma people within Hungary and Poland have already restricted movements, let alone within Europe, as we saw from 2012 to 2017, how Roma citizens from Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were being kicked out of Italy and France as well. So what this freedom of movement has meant for different communities within Eastern Europe and the way in which exclusion is treated is obviously rooted in racialized hierarchies of who belongs and who passes. And while Eastern Europeans may pass, considering that they are perceived as nominally, if tainted Europeans, Roma communities are obviously treated completely different with suspicion, but as are Muslim communities in many instances as well. I mean, just to look at the map of which countries still remain outside of the EU and have been put in this expanded EU integration process, where you essentially see Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania, Macedonia, and Serbia. And so there are certain questions that emerge here about what makes, say, Macedonia or Bosnia less demographic than the far right party that rules Croatia or Bulgaria today. So these are not some technical questions that need to be sorted out in terms of EU integration, but they're actually very real political questions about fundamentally race and religion.
Exactly. I mean, I know how every grandma or school child in Bosnia would answer this question. They would say, pretty simplified, it's because most of us are Muslims. Of course, it's more complex than that, but what role does anti-Muslim racism play in this othering of Europeans as not being really European?
I mean, that's a good question. So there's two ways to answer it. I think one is historical, and I started with Fatma Al-Tayeb, and she's been so influential in my work as well. And I think I will go back to her work, to European Others, where she argues that Muslims and Islam more generally have been the ultimate other, right? And Edward Said points this out in Orientalism. So it's the immediate other. And so it's been considered as this long-standing threat, sort of a trope. And you will see today that most far-right groups in Austria, in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Slovenia, the dominant form of racism emerges as a post-Ottoman overcoming of some sort of a Muslim dominance that then white chivalry and Christianity reemerge and merge with Europe. And so there's a historical narrative that is already there that gets resuscitated every time there is crisis of Europe. And obviously Europe uses crisis to further integrate and to further produce narratives of integration. So I think it plays the role of scapegoat in the sense that these communities of Muslims who are indigenous to the Balkans are continuously produced as a problem, as sort of a unresolved problem for the European Union, in much the same way that nationalist discourses in the 1990s warned Europeans, particularly Serb and Croat nationalist discourses, that this is the green transversal that connects the Muslim world to Europe, this green belt populated by Muslims that poses a threat, and that it needs to be somehow resolved. And I think what's fascinating, though, is that this conversation, as you said, Melina, it's ubiquitous among Muslims in the Balkans, but it's nowhere to be found in public discourses because obviously Europeanization discourses work through, well, you have to fulfill your technical requirements, you have to sort out your corruption and so forth. And so, no, this is not about race, this is not about religion, this is a purely streamlined, technical, colorblind process. But not to expand too much, I also think the way in which Islam is frequently picked up, it's also only in discourses of security threats. So obviously, one discourse that you will find very prominent in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Kosovo, in Bulgaria, that comes from Muslim communities themselves who are under pressure to produce themselves as good Europeans, as willing subjects, and they go out of their ways, especially the Islamske zajednice, which are the Muslim community infrastructures or institutions rather, that will go out of their way to say that we are not like the refugees, we are indigenous Europeans, we are white, our Islam is European, and so forth. So there are layers and layers of how this discourse operates, but I think one of the best things that Fatma Al-Tayeb points out in European Others is that the fact that you have to prove yourself that you are European is indeed a proof that you are neither perceived nor constituted as such.
And we've seen it also during the Bosnian genocide that, according to Bill Clinton's biographer, a lot of French and British politicians were saying that it's a necessary restoration to Europe's Christian roots. So basically just, yeah, it's a genocide, but we'll have our Christian Europe back. And that's also something, like you mentioned before, that it's ubiquitous in at least Bosnia. and everybody knows about it. You can ask school kids, grannies, but it doesn't really come to the attention of people in Western Europe. So can you maybe compare the view that this dominant narrative of Western Europe has on Europe, like these dominant narratives, with the narrative of Europeanness in the Balkans? Of course, there's several perspectives on this within the Balkans, but maybe it would be interesting to compare what do people in the Balkans see when they think about Europe to the vision that people in Western Europe have.
I mean, most of the discourse on Europe has become kind of the dominant form of politicking, in the sense that you would be hard pressed to find any political campaign today in any Balkan country that doesn't involve some promise of European Union integration, especially in what is considered today the Western Balkans, right? The countries that are not still part of it. And of course, there was, until very recently, a real allure to that discourse of Europe. There was a real sort of attraction to the idea that, well, actually, in the end, we may be integrated into the European Union, and this may turn out to be what we have been promised all along. But I think in the last 2 to 3 years, it's become impossible to push that narrative any further, because obviously it's becoming clear that it's not necessarily some checklist that they're not fulfilling, but rather a much more complex and deeper rooted racism that is at place. But I think the fact that the European Union invests so much in civil society, in knowledge production, in master's, bachelor's, and PhD scholarships to students to study European Union integration, the technical agreements, acquis communautaire, and so forth. The massive funds that are poured into media coverage of how the European Union gets covered as well, leaves very little space for critical reflection of how what really people think of the European Union and Europe. And obviously what you get as a response is this quantitative analysis that, yes, people want to join the European Union, and here are the numbers. And there's very little critique or critical rather examination of what people think. But I think when you move through the Balkans and when you speak to people and when you are from there, I mean, you would be hard pressed to find people who don't see Europe and the European Union for what it is, especially in Bosnia and in Kosovo, who know very well the role that the European Union played in the genocide and the war. So I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I mean, fundamentally, it's a subject that is constantly being pushed and mediated, and there is no resistance to it, because to question that narrative means to become a precarious subject. If you're a member of civil society, the moment you question the European Union in any shape or form, you can forget EU funding. If you are an academic, if you start questioning the European Union or coming up with critique about its borders, you can also forget funding. So these are forms of knowledge production that are very closely tied to personal experiences, but also the marketization of civil society, because obviously if you're receiving money from the European Union, you're not going to speak about, how European borders are affecting not just refugee lives, but also local racialized communities.
Yeah, I want to touch on something you said about European values, because that's, I think, one of the differences in these narratives in the Balkans as compared to Western Europe, because European values is something that I heard for the first time when I moved to Germany. In Bosnia, it's like the EU equals money. We want to join the EU because we'll have more money. That's it. And then in Germany, it's all about values and, oh, we had 75 years of peace in Europe because of the EU. And we're like, we didn't have 75 years of peace in Europe. So you're even forgetting what Europe is. So I wanted to ask you, how does this whole conversation of European values serve to produce whiteness?
I mean, a lot of it is amnesia, essentially, because to claim that you've had 70, like the long European peace, right? I mean, the long European peace comes at the expense of colonial expansion, genocide, and violence that Europeans export around the world. So, I mean, yes, there was peace in Europe, but this peace came at a price of destroying lives around the world, and not just lives, but also livelihoods, entire forms of knowledge, economies, extraction of value, the transatlantic slave trade. So these are all processes that were ongoing, and the European expansion was ongoing, just as we talk about the long European peace. As for values, I mean, obviously, I think it's for a country that invented the concept of race, modernity, and colonial violence, and organized totalitarianist regimes that produced events like the Holocaust or the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, to kind of still hold on to values in the face of these kind of histories, it just shows you how Europe is really not ready to reckon with the question of coloniality and race. And I think it's not because the responsibility means reparations. And by reparations, I don't just mean paying reparations to countries that they destroyed, but also reparations as a form of migration. Reparation also means open the borders, because you've made livelihoods impossible for me in Yemen, in Syria, in Namibia. And so obviously this is like Membe says, we are here because you were there. So in other words, these are all interconnected histories, global histories of race, capitalism, and coloniality, which don't, for people who use the kind of vocabulary that speaks of European values, obviously to them, these are what the French called recently Islamo-Gauchism, right? So like even mentioning these historical facts, you come under pressure to denounce them. There's been letters circulating among French academics that practically target critical race scholars, decolonial scholars, because supposedly these are seen as concepts that are imported from the United States, and that Europeans don't necessarily have racism, like that famous panel of 3 white German men decided a couple of weeks ago. I'm pretty sure those of you who are on social media saw it. So you create this kind of falsehoods whereby the continent that created and exported race around the world, along with capitalism and coloniality, today claims that this is a discourse that's been imported from the United States. So obviously, I mean, the question here is, well, what were you doing in Algeria? What were you doing in Vietnam? What were you doing in Indonesia, and so forth? And what are the consequences of those colonial projects for the contemporary racialized violence that people from the Maghreb experience in the peripheries of Paris? But I think it's not enough just to, and I will stop here because I think I'm expanding too far. I think there's also collusion. This is probably the most problematic issue, is that there's a collusion from the left and liberal circles that partake in this. I remember when the terrorist attacks in Paris happened, I believe it was 2016 or 17, Judith Butler issued this statement that said, I'm sitting in Paris, and it feels like because of these terrorist acts, the state is being forced to infringe on the liberties of people, and this is France, and so forth. And when you read that, and you've been to Paris, and you've been to the banlieues, you sort of remain shocked, because you're like, okay, so you realize that in the suburbs of France, Maghrebi youth is being daily subjected to the kind of police violence that you're only witnessing momentarily for a day or two in the cafes in the center of Paris. So there's this imagination that white European liberals have of Europe, of European values and so forth, that is, I mean, in the words of decolonial scholars and Huria Butalja, is essentially an abstraction, because if you live or visit Europe, you know that that's far from the case. But even when you study European history, you know very well, or if you come from the Balkans and you've experienced European history firsthand, then it's very hard to kind of buy into these noble concepts of Europeanness.
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I had about the Nobel Prize going to Handke, who denied the genocide and even was friends with war criminals. Someone said, this is anti-European, but it's like a bunch of Swedish white people voting to give him, a genocide denier, this prize, like the most European thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's instances, it's definitely instances like that where you just realize that there's no ramifications whatsoever. There's no intention of coming to terms with it at all on any level. If anything, there's obviously opposition to it as well.
Yeah, and I also noticed when I tell people about the connections of one of the people he defended to the terror attacks in Utøya and in Christchurch, then people are shocked. And I'm like, okay, so you care about 50 people in New Zealand and 70 people in Norway, but you don't care about more than 100,000 in Bosnia and Kosovo and Croatia. But before we get into all this genocide talk, that's maybe a bit too heavy, I want to get into some questions from our audience. The first one is from Melina Borčak, I don't know because it doesn't have the signs, but she asks about the effect that agreements with countries at the Western Balkans route have on the respect for human rights of refugees and migrants. So she sees a lack of clarity in the division of competencies between the agency Frontex and the member states, and wonders how this lack influences aspects such as status agreements for these people.
So are these the rapid border intervention agreements with non-EU member states, right?
No, she meant member states and Frontex don't have a clear division between their competencies. So I guess they have like excuses to say, well, this crime wasn't committed because of Frontex.
Yes. I mean, that's a great question, because I think one of the ways in which the EU avoids responsibility, it's precisely through this multi-layered competency level. And I think I mentioned briefly that in the case of Croatia, for instance. So even though the European Union has trained Croatian police border, has given them vehicles and surveillance infrastructure, when the Croatian border police engages in violence, then the European Union says, well, actually, this wasn't the EU. This was the question. This was a matter of the Croatian border police, and we actually condemn them. So in this kind of debates, what you see is a kind of like the French presidential parliamentary mixed system, right? If it's a win, the prime minister claims it. If it's a loss, the president claims it. But it's nonetheless, it's the French state. So yes, I mean, of course, there's multiple ways in which it avoids this responsibility. But fundamentally, Frontex is a product of the European Union. It is sponsored by the European Union. All EU funding that goes into border policing are traced back to the European Union. And so the European Union may condemn and suggest that these are acts of violence done by individual nation states. But these individual nation states, I mean, what is the European Union if it's not the collective organization of all these states together? So you can't necessarily single out and say, well, now I'm singling out Greece, now I'm singling out Croatia. Well, this is the European Union. I mean, the European Union isn't an abstraction. It's actually a union, confederacy of states, and all these states partake in it, and they get funding from the EU to police their borders. and they get training from the EU, sometimes even when they're not EU member states, like I explained in the case of Bosnia, Macedonia, and Albania, where you actually have EU police force deployed to train local border guards. So yes, I mean, there's always going to be that kind of maneuvering, but I think even that's a kind of maneuvering of competencies that, oh, this is not under the direct competence of the EU, is also losing its luster because it's so difficult to sustain anymore. I mean, we're all watching what's happening. Just last week, the Greek border guard, which is sponsored and provided for by the EU through migrants with their hands tied into the Mediterranean waters. So, I mean, yes, the European Union would very likely say, well, this is the Greek border guard and so forth. But so, yes, I mean, I see the question, and my answer would be, if it is Frontex, if it is the border police, it is the European Union.
Then another question from an anonymous participant is, my question would be, what categories could be a basis for coalitions of racialized people and communities in Europe? Is the term BIPOC able to include racialized people and communities from and in traveling, migrating through the Balkans?
I mean, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I can answer that question because I think those are questions that are discussed within racialized communities themselves. And the kind of politics of solidarity that emerge within racialized communities are complex and change from context to context. So I can't necessarily say what that project would look like, because obviously in France it may look different from how it may look like in Britain or in Germany, for instance, where you have an entirely different context. But it is an important question in terms of solidarity building. And I think I want to go back to El Taib, of course, where she discusses how queer communities of color in Amsterdam and in Germany discuss the question of community building and solidarity. So I wouldn't answer that question with a specific answer. I would just say that every space, not just in Europe, but around the world, has different ways in which marginalization obviously operates. I mean, I lived in Germany for 2 years when I worked at Max Planck Institute in a working class neighborhood in Göttingen. And I used to go to a Turkish mosque that was there, and it attracted Albanians, Somali, and Turks. But for instance, Bosnians had their own spaces. And so the questions as to why is this, could be spatial, could be generational. I mean, there are many factors. Could be community relations, obviously. So it's an important question that I think racialized communities need to constantly address, obviously, in building cross-sectional forms of solidarity, particularly when it comes to who takes up space and time, and towards what ends is this space and time in the name of being a member of a marginalized or racialized community is being used towards.
Yeah, and I would also agree with you that it's different from country to country, from space to space. And in Germany, there's actually a study about job discrimination, and people with Albanian names were the most discriminated, like even more than other people seen as Muslim, even though, of course, Albanians are not always Muslims. But they are often excluded from all these discourses about race. So I would say for people living in Germany, it's very different than an Albanian in Albania. Then there is another question from our audience. Alice, I hope I said that correctly, a journalist based in Istanbul. Thank you for the talk, she says, or he says, or I don't know, Alice. says, as always, very enlightening. You have eloquently dissected the problems the Balkans faces vis-a-vis the EU. How can local activists, academics, and journalists in the Balkans offer a critique that can resonate with a local audience that have never heard anything negative about the EU? What should that look like? And how do we break that veil of illusion?
I mean, it's a great question, and I have to say I don't have the magic bullet for what that may be. But I think what's important is, so there's been a lot of erasure in the last 30 years, especially among Muslim and Roma communities in the Balkans. I mean, immediately after the war in Bosnia and in Kosovo, international communities came in, and the dominant discourse was, let's all forget about this, what happened. Don't dwell into the past. Focus on European integration. And what's happened is there hasn't been actually a moment in which Muslim and Roma communities in the Balkans have had to process the trauma. And this is not the case only with Muslim and Roma communities in Kosovo and Bosnia, but also in Bulgaria. I mean, we forget that the Bulgarian government expelled nearly 500,000 people after a very long process subjugating the entire community to assimilation, and this doesn't usually register. So, and the fact that a great number of the Muslim community in Bulgaria is Roma, identifies as both Roma and Muslim. So I think what's important is to return to these narratives, return to the unfinished projects, and remind ourselves, but also audiences, of who was responsible for this. I mean, obviously, it's very easy to suggest that, oh, okay, well, this was Serb nationalism. Well, yes, but I mean, let's not forget that Serbs nationalists justified the genocide on Muslims by saying that to Europe that we're doing the job for you. I mean, you've been wanting to do this for centuries, and here we are doing it for you. So, and we know very well that the Serbian regime wouldn't have done it had it not known that it had essentially a free hand in it. So, or a green light to actually go on with it. So I think the first, the most important thing for Muslim and Roma communities is to go to the archive, examine the historical, not just the more recent ones, but the historical ways in which we have been othered, excluded, marginalized, expelled, displaced. And so I think the project starts there. And that's the only way that I can think as a start to kind of confront the idea that, because I mean, what erasure does is that it produces Europe as a savior. And I think Kosovo is a great example of this. I mean, the colonization project of Kosovo in the interwar period between the 1920s and the 1930s was done with the European stamp. And so the idea that Europe somehow saved Kosovo today is a contradiction in all sorts of manners. So I think to confront these narratives is important, in part because there's such an effort to silence these narratives and to sort of move on. But then there's efforts to remember certain types of violence and genocide, those that are convenient to, you know, the European Union bureaucrats or historians who fund and who have immense amounts of money to sponsor knowledge production projects on, you know, how is life under socialism in the 1980s, you know, and oh, I'm so nostalgic about Tito's Yugoslavia in the 1980s, you know, because I lived in a cute little apartment in Belgrade or Novi Sad. Well, where are the experiences of Roma people in socialism? I mean, when you read these projects about memory in the socialist period, you would think that there were no Roma or Muslim people in Yugoslavia, right? I mean, it was all this idyllic place that you just want to go back to all the time. So I think these narratives of nostalgia, narratives, erasures, narratives of amnesia, abstraction, are always confronted by going to the ground, interviewing people who have gone through these experiences, especially older generations who are still around, rather it's oral history, rather it's documentary filmmaking. And I think some of this is already happening on a smaller scale. But of course, to reach a kind of level of coverage that would be that would cover the entire region, you would need funding. And for projects like this, obviously, like I said before, it's not like you're going to get EU or any other kind of funding to do these projects. But slowly, I think it's happening. And Aida's film, for instance, is that's I'm blocking on the name of the film right now.
Quo Vadis Aida?
Sorry?
Quo Vadis Aida, you mean?
Yes, Quo Vadis Aida is a great sort of start to kind of revisit these narratives. So it can also be done through fiction, obviously. I mean, it doesn't always have to be reporting or academic research. So to summarize the answer, I think, yes, there is definitely a necessity for it. And I think a lot of it has to be done from the ground up.
Mm. Oh, you said so many interesting things. I'm just going to touch on two before we have to close. About the movie Quo Vadis Aida, I remember when the director Jasmila Žbanić came to the Bosniak Cultural Center in Berlin to get some funding for the movie. And she said that she sent the script to a lot of European friends, and they all said they can't identify with the main character. They identify more with the Dutch peacekeepers, soldiers who signed up to travel to the other end of the continent, than with normal civilians just living their life in Bosnia. That's one thing that's very important about this whole otherness thing that kind of stuck in my brain for years. And one thing I wanted to mention, you said about the exclusion of Roma people, of Muslims from the Yugoslavian narrative. I mean, it's in the name Yugoslavia. Roma people are not included. Albanians are not included. Okay, Bosniaks are Slavic, but we weren't even allowed to call ourselves Bosniaks ever while that country existed. But now it's so romanticized. So we were kind of excluded from Yugoslavia. We're also excluded from this whole European narrative, which we've talked about extensively. But sometimes we're also excluded from this whole like post-colonial, anti-racist discourse. And somehow we're not really seen as having the right to talk about these issues because we're not enough of all those things. So I often get questions from especially young people who are maybe Bosniaks or Albanians living in Germany, telling me that they don't feel welcome in these anti-racist spaces because maybe their hair is too light or something like this, which of course doesn't erase the fact that maybe they survived concentration camps. So you, with all your wisdom, what would you tell these young people that feel excluded from every side?
I mean, I think to listen to each other. I think it's so important because I think we all come from, we don't know each other's histories. I think the problem with peripheral solidarity is that we really have no idea about what happened, for instance, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Yemen. I mean, obviously we have some idea, but we don't know those experiences, just like they may not know our experiences. And I think to listen to each other and have conversations is so important. And also to acknowledge our privilege. I mean, after all, we have been designated as potentially savable subjects, right? Because we are passing as white. So in a sense, we have this privilege, especially when we compare ourselves to refugees who go through the Balkan route. So I think it's a combination of these things. But I think in the post-colonial framework, there's also a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of unsettle these spatial and temporal imaginaries of what is colonial, right? And so generally we think of colonial as 19th century British colonized India, right? But we don't necessarily think of Palestine today as a colonial project. We give it different names precisely to avoid calling it colonial. And the same goes for Kosovo. I mean, even though the actual legislation for the colonization of Serbia was literally called Kolonizacija Južna Srbija. I mean, it couldn't have been more blatantly obvious that it's a colonizing project. And I think the reason for this, and it's important to go into this, it's because of area studies. I mean, area studies were policy-driven research and knowledge production during the Cold War. And you needed different forms of knowledge to come out of different regions. In Eastern Europe, we're interested in the project of ethnic minorities, let's say, right? So, or the rule of law or whatever. So we're not necessarily interested here about the post-colonial framework. And so the post-colonial framework doesn't obviously come out. This is not to say that there are no local scholars or academics who have produced knowledge on the subject, but it remains local. I mean, it doesn't necessarily reach a broader audience. And so there's no, like the previous question about solidarity, I mean, there's always going to be conflict and misunderstanding in intersectional communities, right? But I think the important thing is, like I said, from a personal experience, to listen to the most marginalized voices and speak and take space once you've heard what is actually going on. And I think the fact that most of the countries where we come from constantly push the narrative of Europeanness and Europe, and I mean, and this comes in different forms. Like, I'll give you one example. Just in 2019, since 2019, actually, there's been massive student protests against the privatization and reforms in the state or public-run universities in Albania. And one of the signs, as the news report, there was a report about it in Top Channel, which is the largest media network in Albanian-speaking spaces. The one sign that kept re-emerging was a sign that said, we are an Aryan race, we have Taliban standards, and we live in Europe. And so the students' way of enacting their injuries was essentially saying, well, how can an Aryan race receive Taliban standards while living in Europe? And so these discourses of race within the national framework are very powerful. I mean, in Bosnia, they manifest differently. If Albanians go to the ancient Illyrians to produce their whiteness and Aryan origins, Bosnians usually go to the medieval period to say, look, before the Ottomans arrived, we were such good Europeans. As a matter of fact, we were all Christians. And as a matter of fact, we were intermarried with Hungarian royalty, right? And so these narratives are constantly reproduced, and they may seem ridiculous because in so many ways, I mean, that the only way you can read them is as fairy tales, right? But the problem is that they are actually taught in school actively, and that is the narratives with which all of us grow up. So that obviously you belong to Europe because racially you are European, and the Ottomans somehow managed to convert you. But don't forget, your real race is white and European, and before you were Muslim, you were Christian, and so forth. And so these are sort of also the narratives that need to be questioned within our own communities. I mean, one last example is the Islamska zajednica Bosna and Herzegovina opened their offices in the European Union in Brussels 2 years ago as a liaison office to engage with the European Union. And I encourage you to go and look for the speech that was given to the European officials. I mean, it essentially said, we are not Arabs. I mean, in verbatim, we are not Arabs, we are not Turks, we are white Europeans, and our Islam is European Islam. So I think we have to take these things, these ways in which we and our communities are complicit in whiteness and white European violence. So I think that needs to be acknowledged, and I think a great amount of work needs to be done within our communities to kind of question these narratives of, well, what is, I mean, I know this European Islam or what are these narratives and why are you actually bringing these narratives up? Like, what is the purpose of reinforcing and forwarding such a narrative? To what end? So yes, I have no answer for it, as I don't think I should, but I think listening and engaging in conversations can't hurt to kind of discuss all these things, reflect on ourselves, on our positionality, and speak from there.
Thank you. That was again very interesting. I could have talked to you for hours more. Maybe the Stiftung will organize another talk. That would be nice. But since we ran out of time, maybe if there's something else you have to say that I didn't ask, you have your chance now.
No, thank you. Thank you all for participating. I just want to thank Pia and Anil again, and you, of course. It's been really a pleasure. And for the participants as well, knowing that, like you said at the beginning, we're all having a Zoom fatigue. But I think it's important that we maintain the focus on the questions that really matter, since there's people out there who are really obviously affected daily by what's happening along the Balkan route. So thank you all very much again.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry.
Do you want to end the discussion?
I didn't want to do that rudely, but yes. Thank you, Melina. Thank you, Piro, also from my side and from the foundation side. It was a great talk, and I think we learned a lot. And I think this event could at least function as one of the stepping stones to know more about what's happening in the different peripheries, as you called it, Piro, and to know more about areas in Europe that some of us, some of the Europeans that might also be watching this Zoom event weren't aware of. So I'm very glad that this could cover so much ground. Thanks a lot. Just one last thing, I would want to shout out to all the people who are watching, who are in between 18 and 26 years old. This is another ad at the end, because we're gonna release a call for applications for a group travel tomorrow. And if you're thinking, yeah, are you crazy? We're in the middle of a pandemic. This is happening. Follow us on our Instagram channel, follow back to us and see what this is about tomorrow. We're gonna release this and we're gonna plan it for late summer this year. Disclaimer, it might be hybrid as well, but we will see. So yeah, I hope to see some of you maybe on the Instagram channel and maybe back again for another event. That would be great. Thanks to both of you and have a good evening, all of you watching.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.